Good afternoon and welcome to Improving Whole Life Value webinar. I hope you're going to have an enjoyable hour hearing about the whole life value. With me today we've got Malcolm Horner from the University of Dundee. I'm Alan Johnston. I work for Construction Scotland Innovation Centre as an innovation manager. The session has been recorded and it will be available on all CSIC channels, including YouTube. After the recording, you'll also get a feedback form. It'd be really good if you could complete that for us, please. In the background, my colleague Danielle's working some wizardry, and there will also be some polls coming up as well. If you're able to answer them, would be great. We do have an opportunity for questions. If we can keep the questions until the end, that would be great. But you'll see a prompt for the questions in a control panel, and if you just press send, and we'll be able to pick up them at the end. Your feedback is very valuable, so it would be really good at the end of the session if you can complete our poll. Would be excellent. Just a bit of an introduction to today's speaker. Malcolm Horner is an Emeritus Professor of Engineering at the University of Dundee and the Chairman of Whole Life Consultants Ltd. Malcolm's one of these people who has been in industry as a civil engineer and also embraced academia. I'm not sure of the span of his career between industry and academia. He can maybe tell us that later. But in his illustrious career, he's been a fellow, or is currently a fellow, of the Institute of Chartered Engineers. He's an honorary fellow of the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland and a former vice principal of the University of Dundee. He's also currently vice chair of RICS and is in a working group on the Global Professional Statement on Cost Prediction and the International Construction Measurement Standards Drafting Group. I'm very familiar with the work of Malcolm and his team at Whole Life Consultants Ltd, having worked together on an Innovate UK funded project, AIM-CH, and that was a really excellent piece of work that was done. So Malcolm's going to tell us about the Innovate UK Living Lab project, Innovate UK funded Living Lab project, and like I say, whole life value. Just a little bit of background in terms of the Living Lab project. It's a £16 million funded project by Innovate UK. There's 26 partner organisations involved, including Whole Life Consultants and the University of Dundee. The project's driven by the Transport Infrastructure Efficiency Task Force, and it's a 2-year project and aims to support continuous improvement in construction infrastructure. And just before I hand over to Malcolm for his presentation, we have got a couple of polls that will be running, and if we maybe just ask Danielle to share one of the polls at the moment. So if you can respond to that poll, would be fabulous. Okay, so that's some interesting reading for Malcolm's presentation. 55% don't measure whole life value, so I hope there's a lot can be gained from Malcolm's presentation, although it is encouraging there, Malcolm, we still have 45%. So without further ado, I'll just hand over to Malcolm for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan, for that introduction. Thank you too to you ladies and gentlemen who've taken time out to join us, and thank you to Danielle and others at CSIC who've made this webinar possible. It's great to have an opportunity to speak to a live audience, even though I can't see you. Just to correct something that Alan said in that magnificent introduction, I'm not actually vice chair of RICS. I'm vice chair of the standard setting committee for the International Construction Measurement Standards. So I don't aspire to lead the RICS. Indeed, I'm not a quantity surveyor, so I doubt I'd be allowed to. You also asked, Alan, how I split my time between academia and industry. So I just did a quick calculation there. I have 27 years in industry and 34 years in academia. And those of you who are doing the sums don't, because some of it overlapped, and I'm not as old as you think I am. So with those introductory remarks, let me move on to the subject today: improving whole life value in infrastructure. And I put in brackets there, and other projects, because most of my remarks will apply to the whole of the construction industry, not just to the infrastructure part. But the living lab, about which I will talk a little presently, does relate entirely to infrastructure. I have to say that the nature of this presentation has changed a bit since I was first asked to do it, and it's changed because last week there was a very important publication from the Construction Leadership Council called A Roadmap to Recovery, and that so piqued my interest that I thought it would be useful to include something about that roadmap and to share with you some of my thoughts about that roadmap, both where I think it's right and where I think maybe it might be improved. So what I wanted to do today was, first of all, to just highlight what I think are the problems, the challenges facing the construction industry, give you an overview of the Living Lab project and how that seeks to address the majority of those challenges, talk quite a bit about benchmarking, because that is a fundamental characteristic of the Living Lab, and then move on to the CLC Roadmap, the Construction Leadership Council Roadmap to Recovery, and cover that with some information about productivity, because those of you who know me will know that productivity is one of my hobby horses, one of my pet subjects. And I get a little concerned when I see information which is quite often not quite factually correct. So talk a little bit about productivity, and then suggest to you how we might look at the roadmap to recovery in a slightly different way from the way that the Construction Leadership Council has looked at it. So I hope that's okay with you. If it isn't, you can switch off and I won't even know you've gone. So what's the problem? Well, in 2015, KPMG produced this report, Climbing the Curve, which showed that 70% of projects roughly exceed budget by more than 10%, and 75% of projects exceed planned duration by more than 10%. In other words, we're not very good at telling our clients how long it's going to take to do a project and how much it will cost. Productivity has always been an issue for the construction industry, and we did some work a couple of years ago for CITB looking at productivity across a wide range of perspectives. But the one in particular that's relevant today is this graph, which shows how productivity in the construction industry, measured in terms of output, has increased over the past 30 or so years, and that average increase is 0.5% per annum. That is a tiny, tiny increase. If we were to measure that growth in terms of GVA rather than in terms of output, then that would go up to 1% per annum. But compared with other industries, our productivity growth has been very, very small indeed. And please note that when I talk about productivity, I mean output divided by labour hours input. So it's output over input, and it's labour hours particularly that we're interested in. So a very concerning performance for government and indeed for the industry. And of course, as far as the environment is concerned, we contribute enormously to CO2 emissions, to greenhouse gas emissions, through the buildings that we build, through the transport networks that we build, through the energy that we encourage people to use in manufacture and living. So we have a great responsibility to the environment as well as to the economy. And then to cap it all, along came COVID. So that itself presents challenges which a lot of people are thinking about, and I've no doubt that many of you in the audience will also have been thinking about. And I'll share some of my thoughts on how we might approach the COVID-19 issue a little later on. So now to the Living Lab and a little bit about it. What is the Living Lab? Well, let me start off with the objectives. Living Lab is concerned with helping particularly government departments, and particularly those concerned with the infrastructure, to procure on the basis of maximum whole life value. We're all aware that it has been traditional for clients to procure on the basis of lowest minimum capital cost. And I think we're all now becoming very well aware that that is not necessarily the best criterion for procuring a construction project. So we're now looking at whole life value, and I'll talk a little later about what we mean by whole life value. That report by KPMG indicated the difficulties that we face in predicting project performance. And I won't name any names, but you will all be aware of those many large projects, recent projects, whose predicted cost has either increased enormously over the past couple of years or has actually been exceeded. There is, of course, much optimism in the industry about the impact of methods of construction, and particularly off-site manufacture, which is a subset of modern methods of construction. There is a desire to demonstrate the benefits that can be brought about by a wider adoption of modern methods of construction. And those include, of course, not only off-site manufacture, but also digitalization and digital engineering. Perhaps a little unusually, a fourth objective is to demonstrate how benchmarking can drive improved performance in the industry, and therefore to encourage industry to take up the notion of benchmarking and use benchmarking, which involves shared data, I have to add, to use benchmarking to drive performance. And I'll talk some more about that shortly. And of course, overall, the desire is to reduce costs, to improve productivity, and to increase social benefit in all its aspects. And social benefit includes economic benefit, it includes environmental benefit, and includes health and well-being. So, not a very ambitious set of objectives, you might think, but certainly very challenging. So the Living Lab is, as Alan mentioned, a £16 million project, which is funded by Innovate UK and the 27 partners that make up the Living Lab partnership. It is a very complex project. As you can imagine, coordinating 27 partners is an incredibly challenging task, and I'm just very grateful that we have nothing to do with that. That task lies in the hands of the National Skills Academy for Rail, NSAR, and their appointed project manager, Lindberger Associates. But they will work with us and will work together to realize those objectives which I showed on the previous slide. But let me tell you a little bit more now about what's actually going to go on in the Living Lab. And this next slide illustrates what's inside the Living Lab. And I have to thank Costain for giving me permission to use this site. Charlie Davis kindly let me use it after I'd seen him use it himself. So thank you, Costain. Thank you, Charlie, for that. So inside the Living Lab, there are 6 what we call demonstration projects. I like to think that 4 of those projects are what we might call physical projects. They're asset type projects, and the other 2 projects are process related demonstration projects. So let me deal first of all with the 4 physical type demonstration projects. These are cooling panels, cable route management system, footbridges, and data rooms. And I'll explain a little more about each one of those in turn. The purpose of the demonstration projects is to show how performance can be improved by the application of modern methods of construction, so that each one of these projects will be using a new and innovative approach to satisfying the requirements of the project. So if I start with the cooling panels, this is a project for Transport for London, and Transport for London are facing the challenge of increasing temperatures in their underground systems, and those increasing temperatures have a limiting effect upon the number of tube trains that can run per hour. So they're very keen to install cooling panels in stations to reduce the ambient temperature. And those cooling panels will be of an advanced design, and the construction methods that will be applied will also be non-traditional. At the same time, Transport for London have a very complicated cable routing system for their control systems, and particularly for their signalling systems. And these traditionally have caused a great deal of hardship when it comes to installing new signalling systems. So their cable route management system demonstration project will use digital engineering to try to improve the process of designing and installing new cable systems. Also with Transport for London, they have a whole series of data rooms. And data rooms are used to house control equipment and are found in a variety of locations. And of course, because of the increasing controls, the number of data rooms and the size of them is also increasing. And at the same time, the space available for housing data rooms is decreasing as that space becomes used for other purposes. And moreover, that space is quite often an irregular shape, which makes the thought of off-site manufacture for data rooms a very challenging thought. But nevertheless, it is Transport for London's intent to develop with their partners an off-site manufacturing system for data rooms, which will be sufficiently flexible to accommodate almost any shape and size. So those are 3 physical demonstration projects that are being promoted by Transport for London. The 4th physical asset is the footbridge, which is promoted by Network Rail and potentially also by Highways England. But Network Rail have a particular issue with footbridges. Their footbridges are quite often very old, as you will be well aware. They're used mainly to connect platforms, and Network Rail are very concerned that they provide their customers with the best possible experience. So they are in the process, again with their partners, of redesigning footbridges to a standard design to make them much more attractive and much more functional and much easier to install than the current generation of footbridges. So that's the 4th physical demonstration project. And then there are 2 process-orientated demonstration projects. The first is a logistics project, which aims to understand in much more detail and to seek to optimize the logistics involved, particularly in off-site manufacture, because we know that in off-site manufacture, logistics becomes an important part of the whole process of manufacture, transport, and installation. And the second process demonstration project is it used to be called the control room. It's now called the integrated control system, and that is promoted by Costain. And the purpose of that is, if you can imagine the inside of a power station and the control room in a power station, which is constantly receiving information about how the power station is performing so that controls can be applied. Well, in the same way, the vision for this demonstration project is that it will be a control room that continuously receives live information from a construction project so that the managers can see how that project is performing as it is being constructed and take any necessary remedial action that is appropriate. So those are the 6 demonstration projects which are taxing the Living Lab. Moving on then to benchmarking, because benchmarking underpins much of the Living Lab activities. It seeks to measure the change in performance that is brought about by the demonstration projects, and it also seeks to develop a generic benchmarking system so that clients from whatever transport department, and hopefully from other types of projects, can share their data and understand the extent to which their own project is performing better or worse than those of other people with similar projects. And it can also be used, of course, to help improve predictability, because it will help to provide standards, norms, against which one can measure whether or not the predicted price of a project, or the predicted duration of a project, or the predicted carbon emissions of a project are reasonable. So we can think of that in terms of a series of questions like, would it help to know how other similar projects perform? Well, I hope the answer to that is yes. Just as I would like to know whether or not the performance in my project lay in the upper decile, the lower decile, or was just about average. And most importantly, I would like to know that if my project was performing differently from other projects, what the cause of those differences was, so that I could address those causes, hopefully successfully. So supposing that we could gather together data from a whole series of similar projects on performance, and that performance could be productivity, it could be cost, it could be social value, it could be any measure of performance, and we'll come back to that later. And supposing I could plot the performance of my project relative to the performance of a population of similar projects, then I would be able to know, for instance, on this particular graph, that actually something over 60% of the projects that were similar to mine were actually performing better than mine. Somewhat less than 40% are performing worse than my project. This is not a new technique. It's a technique that's been used in the North Sea. As far as I'm aware, it was first came about because of the work by McKinsey, who started to benchmark on behalf of North Sea oil operators the cost of raising a barrel of oil. And when Shell found that their costs were in the lower quartile of all their competitors' costs, there were major discussions at board level, I'm told. So it's really helpful at promoting change, at promoting improvement, and that's really what it's there to do. But of course, the question then arises, so what should we be benchmarking? Well, we've been through a process of consultation, a wide consultation with industry and with the partners in the Living Lab project. And I should have said that the partners are the Transport and infrastructure efficiency strategy, and the task force which drives that strategy. And those ties partners, I should say, are HS2, our Network Rail, our Transport for London, and Highways England, all coordinated by the Department for Transport. And having gone through this process of consultation, we came up with the areas of benchmarks where people were most interested, and you see those on the slide in front of you. Whole life cost, note whole life cost, duration of different phases, duration of design phases, duration of construction phases, productivity, pre-manufactured value, that is the extent to which off-site manufacture is incorporated in the project, quality, the quality of the finished product, environmental issues, and particularly carbon emissions, how much carbon are we emitting, and social value, what are the social benefits brought about by our projects. And certainly social value is gaining more and more importance and increasingly becoming a focus of attention. I will come back to social value in just a moment too. Of course, the important thing is that we compare like with like, and this has been a real issue for the industry for many, many years. And in addressing that issue, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, RICS, set about producing an international construction measurement standards set, which encourage people to report costs in a standard format, that is, with a standard cost breakdown structure, but at the same time to report the context of the project to which those costs related. And the context of the project was described through a series of attributes and values, that is, the principal characteristics of a project that might affect its cost. The ICMS first edition was published in July 2017, and the second edition came out just last October. They're both available free of charge. You can download them from the RICS Coalition website. Incidentally, these international construction measurement standards have been put together by a coalition of 44 countries, so they are truly international. And I had the privilege of serving on the standard setting committee for both those editions. And just as a bit of a plug for Whole Life Consultants, if you're interested in seeing a spreadsheet which would take you through the way in which the international construction measurement standards work, then please you can download some free software from this website, and you will all be getting copies of these slides, so the URL will be available to you. So that's the Living Lab, and that's what we're trying to do in the Living Lab. We're trying to improve whole life value, and we're trying to do that through a series of demonstration projects to show how modern methods of construction can improve performance, and to show how benchmarking can drive performance and can improve predictability. So I'm going to move on to COVID-19 now, and this is clearly of serious consideration for the Living Lab, because the program that we designed for the Living Lab did not take account of COVID. So we are going to have to take account of COVID in this program, and therefore it's essential that we think about COVID and what its impact might be. So some of the impacts of COVID, which you'll all be familiar with, I suspect, are first of all, potentially a reduction in the volume of activity in the construction industry. I would like to be optimistic, but it's very difficult to see how government can service the debt that it has run up in counteracting the COVID threat without increasing taxation in one form or another. And an increase in taxation means a reduction in spending power, either in the public sector or in the private sector, or both. And a reduction in spending power, it seems to me, is inevitably going to have an impact upon the construction industry. So it does seem to me that we should be prepared, at least in the next couple of years or so, to see a reduction in the volume of activity. And that in itself will cause a reduction in labour demand. And as we all know, there have been serious concerns about labour shortages in the construction industry. I think those concerns may be to some extent alleviated, but again, I'll come back to that point shortly. There are reports that there will be a reduction in productivity because of the additional safety measures, particularly in terms of social distancing, that will need to take place on our construction sites. Certainly there is concern that there will be a reduction in output, and in the reports that I read, it is expected that there will be a reduction in productivity. But I'm going to return to that as well shortly. And there will also be a reduction as a result in the demand for site plant. There will be supply chain fragility because the supply chain has to recover from the impact of COVID. So we might find more difficulty in getting suppliers and particularly materials to site. Therefore, there will be a greater potential for delays. And then, having said that there could be a reduction in productivity, there could also be the opportunity to increase productivity. And I'll explain shortly why I think that may be a very real possibility. And it's also been suggested that because only the fittest will survive, that as a result, the performance of the whole industry will improve significantly. Well, it would be interesting to see if that's what happens. Moving on a little more quickly now, CLC published last week its roadmap to recovery, and what I took from that were 5 major issues. First of all, a focus on whole life social value, and I've explained how the Living Lab reflects that. A shift to modern methods of construction, and the Living Lab takes up that challenge. Collaborative working to improve productivity, and I think there is a lot of evidence that collaborative working does indeed improve productivity. The suggestion that working hours should be extended, and that's something that I want to come back to, and the suggestion that we should invest in infrastructure as a means of creating jobs, and that's also something that I will come back to. So now to talk just a little bit about things more general, social value, social whole life value. What do we mean by that? Well, there are lots and lots of definitions, and I have to confess that I don't know them all. But I think the simplest way for me of thinking about it is to think in terms of sustainability and the 3 traditional pillars of sustainability: environmental, economic, and social sustainability, and environmental, economic, and social value. And that, I think, is what we mean by social value, by benefits to the community, community benefits, as they're often referred to. One of the things that we are beginning to look at very closely now in the Living Lab and elsewhere is the old-fashioned notion of the cost-benefit analysis, but where the benefits include all the social benefits as well as the cost and the economic benefits and the environmental benefits. So we're really looking at whole life value in its broadest sense, and we're seeking to minimize the cost whilst maximizing whole life value. And that's what the Living Lab is aiming to do. And that's, of course, what CLC is aiming to do in its roadmap to recovery. CLC is promoting OSM, as is the Living Lab. Clearly, in post-COVID, there is going to be much safer working conditions in a factory environment than in a site environment. Certainly, it's going to be easier to social distance in a factory environment than in a site environment. So safety, I think, is going to be a big driver of off-site manufacture in the immediate future. And of course, there is some evidence to show that you will get improved quality of build and improved performance, particularly in environmental areas, through off-site manufacture. Other benefits which are suggested are increased productivity and reduced costs, but I have to say that we have not been able to find any hard data to substantiate claims about increased productivity and reduced costs. That isn't to say that it's not correct, just that we haven't been able to find the data. So one of the things that we want to do is to develop data sets to settle these discussions one way or the other. What we have done is to carry out a survey of experts in off-site manufacture to see what they thought the effect of off-site manufacture might be in terms of productivity. And what we found was that for panelized designs, they anticipated a 4% reduction in the total labor in the whole process, that is through manufacture, transport, and installation. And if we move to volumetric OSM, then the thought is, and these are thoughts, not hard data, that that would result in a 14% reduction in total labor. And in both cases, there will be a shift in skills trades from on-site to off-site, a major shift, which of course is incredibly important in terms of COVID. But there is no hard data, as I say, and productivity is something which has been of interest to us for many, many years now. And I think we have the opportunity to improve our productivity on construction sites brought about by the COVID pandemic. This graph just shows the effect of interruptions on productivity on construction sites. And in summary, what it shows is that if you have an interruption on a construction site lasting longer than 15 minutes, then you will suffer a loss in productivity in the time that remains of something close to 30%. Interruptions are major causes of loss of productivity on construction sites. The major causes of interruptions are sequencing problems, waiting for information, and waiting for materials. And I think that we need to turn our minds to how we minimize those interruptions with a view to maximizing the productivity on our construction sites. Now, CLC has suggested that we should extend our working hours, but I just want to draw your attention to a piece of work that was done in the States, it has to be said in the last century, I think about the 1980s, and because I'm working from home, I can't get into the office to look up the reference, but it was a piece of work that was undertaken with a precast concrete manufacturer who was manufacturing pipes, and all of a sudden he got an increased order which required him to increase his output by 50%. So what he did was to increase the working hours in his factory from 40 hours a week to 60 hours a week. And sure enough, in the first week, output increased, as you might expect, by 50%. But interestingly, over the next 10 weeks, the output fell back to what it used to be when you worked a 40-hour week, even though he was still working a 60-hour week. And it was suggested that the reason for that was because people have in their minds a fixed view of what constitutes a reasonable output for a week's work. And there's been a lot of work done in America, and this graph is a very crude approximation to the average of everything that's been published in the States about the effect of overtime working, prolonged overtime working on productivity. And in very crude terms, for every increase in your working week beyond 40 hours, you will suffer a 1% loss in productivity. So if you work an 80-hour week, you will suffer a loss in productivity of 40%. So I'm not sure that extending working hours is actually what we need to do post-COVID, and I'll suggest in a moment what I think might be a better strategy. CLC also suggested that we should invest in infrastructure. Now, it may well be that investing in infrastructure provides us with most bangs for our buck if we're thinking in terms of whole life social value. I think that that is a very strong possibility. However, if we're thinking about job creation, then I think we need to think slightly differently, because, and I can't give you the figures because they're confidential, so I've normalized them to 100 for infrastructure, so that if, for instance, it took 100 person years per £1 million worth of output to create a piece of infrastructure, in new housing, you will get 160 person years for the same £1 million, and in housing R&M, you get 210 person years for your £1 million. Now, those are not real person years, but they are normalized to infrastructure as being 100. So if you really want to improve job prospects, then you would go for housing R&M in preference to infrastructure. Having said that, if you were going for whole life value, you might well go for infrastructure rather than housing R&M. So here we are, we have a crisis, and there was an excellent report published in 2014 by Constructing Excellence, which was entitled Never Waste a Good Crisis, and it was a really good report, but I think we've got another opportunity not to waste a good crisis here, because I think that we have the opportunity to rethink somewhat what we do in terms of improving the performance of the construction industry, and in terms of improving the quality of the provision to our clients. So I would suggest that if we want to increase more jobs, more employment, then we should look at investing in housing and R&M, as well as investing in infrastructure. I think it's clear that we need to shift to off-site manufacture for all the reasons that I've already suggested. I think there is very good reason for moving towards more collaborative planning. Collaborative planning is a lean technique which brings together everybody who's concerned with the outcome of a project, to make sure that everybody understands what the challenges are and knows how to overcome them. So I think that's essential. I think we need to train even more and better site managers to understand how productivity can be increased, about the importance of planning, about the importance of reducing interruptions, about the importance, particularly post-COVID, of sequencing, making sure that everything is ready for the next trade and that people are not hanging around waiting for the last piece of work to be completed. I think we can use benchmarking and the sharing of data as a great way of learning more about how to predict with more certainty the outcomes of our projects, and also how to improve the performance of our projects at the design stage and during construction. The thought did strike me that with remote working, it may well be, and social distancing, it may well be advantageous to rethink how we actually look at what's going on a construction site by providing, for example, video cameras on everybody's helmet, so that we could see what they were doing, we could see what the challenges were that they were facing, and with the appropriate technology, so that we could send them instructions as to what to do and to provide the information they needed to do the job. And finally, and an interesting thought, if people have an idea of what represents a decent working week, who's to say that 6 hours, and some people have experimented with this, that 6-hour shifts won't produce as much work as 8-hour shifts? And if instead of thinking of a 12-hour shift, that is extended working, and having a 40% loss of productivity, we thought about 2 6-hour shifts, which would A, employ twice the number of people, and B, potentially increase productivity significantly, and C, use our plant and equipment much more effectively, despite there being serious issues around handovers between the two shifts. Nevertheless, I think that there is some creative thinking to be done around how we address the challenges that COVID-19, and indeed that have always existed in the construction industry, how we address those challenges. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that's given you an overview of the Living Lab project. I hope that I've perhaps sparked some ideas in your minds. I hope that I've perhaps confirmed some of your own views, and I have no doubt that some of you will disagree with what I've said, but that's the name of the game, and that's why I'm very happy now to try and answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Malcolm. Just before we hand over to questions, really just want to thank you again for a very insightful presentation. I know we've got a couple of questions that have come through, but just listening to your presentation, a couple of things came to my mind, if you like, and particularly, you know, this is obviously a pivotal moment for construction with everything that's going on with COVID, and you showed that earlier slide in terms of the productivity 0.5%, I think it was, each year, so it'll be really interesting to see what happens post-COVID, and that's why I think it is very much a pivotal moment. And let's see if OSM can pick up in that slack, if you like. And they do say through adversity comes opportunity and indeed innovation. And it did remind me of one of the things we're doing at CSIC. You mentioned collaboration, and one of the things that we've got is our ICON platform and a matchmaking platform, so very much looking at see where there can be opportunities, you know, where the construction industry's got various challenges as a result of COVID, and some people might have solutions out there. So that sprung to my mind when you were talking about collaboration. I'm just about to go over to the questions. Just before I do that, we've got one more poll that we should see. It's just come up. So, room for improvement in the construction industry, what people's views are and the percentages there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah. So, vast majority at the 30+ there. Yeah, very interesting. I'll just turn over to go over to questions now, Malcolm. So the question I've got here, and actually you mentioned this in some ways, but someone was reading your mind. But if productivity reduces with increased hours, would reduced hours not increase productivity? So you did mention that, but what's your thoughts on it, or would you like to expand?
Well, one of the issues for all of us is having reliable data, and I don't have any data which would suggest that productivity would increase with reduced hours, but I have a very strong gut sensation that it would, in the light of everything that I read about and everything that I experience when we increase hours. And you know, just think of yourself. If you're digging your garden for an hour, you'll actually be much more productive than if you dig your garden for 2 hours, because you get less tired, amongst other things. So I think that there is a very strong possibility that reducing working hours would increase productivity, and I'd dearly love to see somebody test it. Yeah,
yeah. One of the other interesting stats that you produced earlier as well, which is quite frightening actually, in terms of the slide on interruptions. I think it was 23% waiting on materials. So quite clearly there's some low-hanging fruit there, Malcolm.
Well, there is low-hanging fruit, potentially, but also, of course, with post-COVID, I think, as I said, I think the supply chain is going to be quite fragile. So, you know, manufacturers are going to take some time to get back up to full steam. And I think there's going to be a peak in demand for particular materials which may be difficult to meet. So, you know, I think we're going to have to look out for those interruptions. But the secret to minimizing all the interruptions is in better planning. And I just don't feel that we put enough effort into detailed short-term planning. And that's what collaborative planning, the lean technique of collaborative planning, is all about.
Yeah, of course. Another couple of questions that have come through here. So what happens to the Living Lab at the end of the project?
Well, the Living Lab has to prove itself. And all those 27 partners are intent on making sure that it does improve itself. And if that is the case, it is the hope that it will have demonstrated the importance of continuing with the notion of demonstration projects as a way of bringing about change in the industry, but also continuing with benchmarking as a way of driving improved performance. So it's very much hope that this will not all come to an end after the 2 years duration of the project, but that it will continue beyond that in perpetuity as a driver of improved performance, particularly in terms of whole life social value throughout the industry, although of course it starts off as a government initiative.
Yeah. And I suppose that would be a key element of the Innovate UK funding, is showing that long-term effect as well, which would be ultimately very important. Just in terms of you've mentioned the economic, environmental and social benefits and social value and how they could be maximised. Can they be done at the same time?
Well, that's a $64,000 question. There are two schools of, well, there are many schools of thought actually. Environmentalists would argue that you should put environment, and there's strength in this argument, ahead of everything else, so that you should seek to minimize the legacy, the harmful legacy that we may be leaving for future generations. And I can totally empathize with that view. But in reality, if that costs more money, then we have to balance affordability against the benefits that might otherwise come about. Because if we have a limited amount of money to spend, then obviously we want to get the maximum bangs for our buck. However, it is often the case that with some creative thinking, we can actually maximize social benefits and environmental impacts, or rather minimize environmental impacts, at the same time as lowering the initial cost of a project. But there are also other approaches which are around creative financial models, in which, for instance, if it were going to cost more to produce the optimum whole life value outcome, how about setting up a loan fund which would allow you to increase expenditure at the beginning of the project, but allowed you to pay back the loan that you had to take to increase that expenditure as a result of the savings that you made throughout the life of the project. I think the whole thing needs to be thought about really creatively. And I think that if you do that, you can actually address all three concerns simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and are there any examples of that from across the world that you're aware of? It always seems to be there's people's view quite often that it comes to cost and reduce cost and efficiency. When I say efficiency in terms of costs, the compromise is social and environmental, and I'm not sure there may be some great examples out there, but that seems to be a bit of a trade-off in people's minds at time. With a reduced costs, the trade-off is environmental. Of course, these days we can't afford to do it. You can't afford to trade off environment or social benefits, or you shouldn't be. And certainly in light of where we are with COVID, it'd be even more important not to trade it off.
Well, absolutely. And to answer your question, I can't bring any examples to mind, but I'm pretty sure that there are examples around of projects where they have found, particularly in terms of environmental impacts, that by reducing environmental impacts, they've also been able at least to contain the capital costs, if not reduce it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm conscious of time. I don't know if there'll be a last question coming up just before we'll probably need to wrap up soon. Just one final one, just I suppose in the back of the maximising the social, economic and environmental, can you actually measure these benefits in the same type of units?
Well, that's another $64,000 question. We did a lot of work in trying to find what we called a common currency, in which we did measure social, environmental and economic impacts in the same units. We did come up with a unit which was called Exergy, which was invented by chemists, and I don't pretend to understand Exergy, I have to say, but it is a very complicated approach to looking at effectively the amount of energy that is consumed or that is impacted by construction. We also looked at pounds, shillings and pence, and of course that's what the UK government is effectively doing in the Green Book, is putting cash to social and environmental benefits. So that is one way of doing it, but we actually came to the conclusion that what's called a reductionist approach, that is reducing it all to a single currency, you lose a lot of the richness of what it is you're trying to measure. And particularly in terms of social value, we are looking forward to learning from some experts in the Living Lab consortium. Social Profit Calculator, one of the partners, are experts in measuring social value, and I'm certainly looking forward to see how they do that, because I know there's a lot of controversy and a lot of complexity in the measurement of social value. So there are some big unknowns there, Alan.
Yeah, yeah. No, thanks very much for that. Something that I might have missed, and it was probably mentioned. When does the Living Lab project start? I know it's a 2-year project.
It has started. Yeah. So we're just in the first month of the first flush of senility, as somebody once said to me. But no, the first flush of enthusiasm. Yeah, no, that's great. Well, can I just thank you again? I know you're very busy. I'm really looking forward to hearing the results of the Living Lab project. Also, thank you for the audience, and thank you for your questions. There will be a follow-up questionnaire, and if you can please respond to that, it would be really good. It helps us with future webinars. This webinar is part of our ICON series. I mentioned the ICON platform earlier on. We've also got a series of ICON webinars, and you can go onto the CSIC website and get full details of future webinars. So thanks again. Just closing off now, and also thank you, Danielle, who's been working away in the background with the polls, the questions, and the technology. So thank you. Thank you. Goodbye. Bye.